Oedipus is the king of Thebes. He has been directed by the oracle to banish the killer of the previous king, Laius. After receiving some details about it from his wife, he realizes that the murderer may be himself. He tells a story from his past in which he killed a man whom he thought meant nothing to him in a fit of rage along the road. This is how Oedipus describes the murder.
When I had come close up to those 3 roads, I came upon a herald, and a man like him you have described seated in a carriage. The man who held the reins, and the old man himself, would not give me room, but thought to force me from the path. I struck the driver in my anger. The old man, seeing what I had done, waited till I was passing, then struck me a blow upon the head. I paid him back in full, for I knocked him out of the carriage with a blow of my stick. He rolled upon his back, and after that, I killed them all! Ah! Ah! Ah!
It is clear from these lines that Oedipus suffers from wrath. He is prone to rage over a petty thing, a bump in the road. And there are other lines in this play which carry the theme of wrath. Tiresias says to Oedipus at line 391 of the Fagles translation, "Do as you like. Build your anger to whatever pitch you please. Rage your worst." Creon says to Oedipus at line 746, "Look at you, sullen and yielding, brutal in your rage." And Jocasta says to him at line 767, "For the love of God, Oedipus, why this rage?" But the more interesting thing is how this rage relates to the concept of criminal intent. And by this I mean how we should perceive his guilt, or the level of his guilt, especially when we remember that in ancient Greece, to kill your father was especially bad. So how do we assess the guilt of Oedipus when he did not know it was his father that he killed? Right? The story is that when Oedipus was a young man living in Corinth, he consulted the oracle, and when it was foretold that he would murder his father, he fled and killed 4 people on the road, not knowing that one of them was Laius, his biological father. Should we care that he didn't know the identity of the man he killed? The unknowingness of Oedipus is important, and it is not confined to one unlucky happenstance. It is a constant theme in this play. We will watch him suspect Creon of conspiring with Tiresias and become willing to sentence him to death, which shows us that even in the ongoing present, Oedipus is willing to kill someone without knowing if he should. And throughout the play, language indicating his unthinking rashness is consistently maintained. He's not a king who acts based on knowledge. Tiresias says to him, "You with your precious eyes, you're blind to the corruption in your life." At line 473, "All unknowing, you are the scourge of your own flesh and blood." And Oedipus eventually fears that these words were right when he says at line 820, "I think I've just called down a dreadful curse upon myself. I simply didn't know." And the most important line for the purpose of this video and his intent comes at line 1105, when the messenger from Corinth says to Oedipus, "My boy, it's clear you don't know what you're doing." And his lack of knowledge, combined with his rage, paints the character of Oedipus as an ignorant, unsteady man with no rudder in life. And in a more evocative way, we see this part of him in his own words. After he first learned the prophecy, this is how he describes his reaction at line 876. "I abandoned Corinth," he says, "running, always running towards some place where I would never see the shame of all those oracles come true." Now, as far as him committing the crime that was predicted, there's a certain fixation when discussing Oedipus Rex, if I'm going based on the Bernard Knox introduction to it in my edition, that focuses on fate and the bondage of the will. Freud calls the play a tragedy of destiny. I don't agree with fixating on this. And in my opinion, Sophocles does not believe we are powerless to avoid an outcome. If we recall in Antigone, Tiresias says to Creon at line 1133 of the Fagles, a man can turn his back on folly, misfortune too, if he tries to make amends. These lines suggest that a man has free will. And I believe Oedipus Rex can be read according to the doctrine of John Milton in Book 3 of Paradise Lost, when the Lord God says, foreknowledge has no influence on their fault. That the crime of Oedipus was foreseen had no impact on his fault, his rage. So back to the concept of intent, the question is this: which criminal is worse? The one who knows who he is killing, or the criminal like Oedipus who does not know? In other words, should we lessen the charge against Oedipus for not knowing who it was he killed? And the answer we are going to give here in this video is no, we should not. Oedipus is the worst sort. Which of the following is better? Do we prefer the person who voluntarily does ill, or the person who involuntarily does ill? There is a book called Lesser Hippias written by Plato, in which Socrates discusses this topic with Hippias. And Socrates takes the same stance that we're taking, that the person who perpetrates a bad action involuntarily is worse than the person who perpetrates a bad action voluntarily. Socrates uses the example of running, and it's a little amusing. He asks Hippias, does not he who runs slowly run badly, and he who runs fast run well? Yes, says Hippias. Socrates says, which, then, is the better runner? He who runs slowly voluntarily, or he who does so involuntarily? Hippias says, he who does it voluntarily. And Socrates says, then he who runs badly performs a bad and disgraceful act in a race. Hippias says, yes, a bad act, of course. So Socrates says, then the good runner performs this bad and disgraceful act voluntarily, and the bad runner involuntarily. So we see where Socrates is going with this? That the worst person has no control over their disgracefulness. And so Socrates concludes with the next line, in running then, he who does bad acts involuntarily is worse than he who does them voluntarily, and Hippias must agree. Which is to say that the person who has the capacity to do something well but chooses not to is preferable to the person who has no capacity. So if we follow this logic, then the person who says something that is false and does not know that it is false is worse than the person who says something that is false and knows it. Again, we can rely on some lines from Socrates, who says, I think that those who speak falsehood voluntarily are better than those who do so involuntarily. Let us keep this in mind and look at this false statement made by Oedipus at line 118 after Creon says, our leader, my lord, was once a man named Laius. And Oedipus says, I never saw the man myself. This turns out to be wrong. In fact, Oedipus had seen Laius on the day he murdered him. So is this a lie? Or is he to be forgiven for speaking false involuntarily or from a lack of knowledge? And if we continue to draw logical conclusions, we must say that the unknowing person, like Oedipus, an unknowing person, is not just liable to say something wrong, but they are also incapable of speaking the truth. So if you need someone to speak the truth ever, they're never your man, are they? Neither if you need somebody to do anything good. And all the worse when the person is a king. Creon implies that Oedipus is just this sort of person. After Oedipus asks him why, Tiresias never accused him of the murder back when it happened. At line 634, the great seer never accused me then. Why not? And Creon says, I don't know. And when I don't, I keep quiet. which is to say that Creon is claiming that he doesn't speak to something about which he is ignorant, right? Distinguishing himself from Oedipus, who speaks even when he does not know. That is an important detail, that Oedipus not only speaks false, but cannot refrain from speaking in general, and has no desire to refrain from taking action or from talking bullshit, though he is ignorant of the facts, so long as he thinks he is protecting his own interests. In that very scene we just quoted, Oedipus was prepared to put his own brother-in-law to death with no proof. This sort of ignorant leader is considered in Plato's dialogue the sophist, when a stranger from Elis says, "I do see one large and grievous kind of ignorance, separate from the rest, and as weighty as all the other parts put together." What is it? Thytetus asks. Thinking that one knows a thing when one does not know it. Through this, I believe all the mistakes of the mind are caused in all of us. And furthermore, to this kind of ignorance alone the name stupidity is given. Amathion is the Greek word, I think, that has been translated as stupidity. But Oedipus has done something much worse than fail to know. He has made the goodness of his actions dependent on his assumed knowledge, which is to say, that he murdered Laius on the assumption that he was a stranger, to the extent that he thought about what he was doing at all. It means he maintains a depraved and vicious outlook to his fellow men. It is possible that this outlook stems from his own vague suspicion that he is ignorant. He suspects that he is ignorant and that he is vicious. For why else would he flee from Corinth? If he had any faith in his own nature, think what he must sense about himself. To believe that he cannot be around his own father for fear he might kill him, or to be around his own mother for fear he might marry her. It is to be wondered if he ever feared committing the act in and of itself, or if he really just feared to be exposed for what he is to all the world. By the end of the play, he finally knows, and it is precisely because he could never truly see that it is fitting he plucks out his eyes, exclaiming, "Too long you looked on the ones you never should have seen, blind to the ones you longed to see, to know, blind from this hour on."